Rich cowboy feigns sleep to test shy Maid and freezes seeing what she does. Jackson Montgomery was a man who had learned to trust no one. At 38 years old, he sat on top of one of the most successful cattle ranches in all of Montana. The Montgomery Ranch stretched across 10,000 acres of rolling grassland, with mountains rising in the distance like silent guardians. Hundreds of cattle grazed on his land, and his brand was known throughout the state for quality beef. But Jackson hadn't inherited this empire. He had built it himself, starting with nothing but a dream and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. 15 years ago, Jackson had been just another ranch hand working for someone else, saving every penny he could. He slept in a tiny room above a barn and ate simple meals. But he had vision. He saw opportunities where others saw only hard work and risk. Slowly, carefully, he bought his first piece of land, then another. He made smart decisions about breeding cattle, about managing resources, about when to sell and when to hold back. His reputation grew. People respected his work ethic and his results. But success had come with painful lessons. Over the years, Jackson had been betrayed more times than he cared to remember. A former business partner had stolen money from their joint account and disappeared. An employee he considered a friend had been selling cattle on the side and pocketing the profit. A woman he thought he loved had only been interested in his growing bank account. Each betrayal had added another layer of protection around his heart, another reason to keep people at arm's length. Now Jackson lived alone in the large ranch house his success had built. The house was beautiful, with wooden beams crossing the high ceilings and large windows that looked out over his land, but it felt empty most of the time. Jackson told himself he preferred it that way. No one to disappoint him, no one to lie to him. Just honest work with animals who didn't pretend to be something they weren't. For years, Mrs. Henderson had been his housekeeper. She was a grandmother in her 70s who kept the house clean and occasionally cooked meals. Jackson trusted her as much as he trusted anyone, which still wasn't much. But Mrs. Henderson's arthritis had gotten worse, and she needed to retire to live with her daughter in Oregon. Jackson had been sorry to see her go, but he understood. The cleaning agency in town had sent a replacement. Her name was Maria Santos, and from the moment she arrived, Jackson noticed she was completely different from Mrs. Henderson. Maria was young, probably in her mid-20s. With dark hair she kept pulled back in a simple braid. Her clothes were old but clean, and her shoes had clearly seen better days. What struck Jackson most was how she carried herself. She moved quietly, almost like she was trying not to take up space. Whenever Jackson walked into a room where Maria was working, she would stop what she was doing, lower her eyes respectfully, and step aside. Her English was broken and hesitant. She would say, "Good morning, Mr. Montgomery," in a soft voice, then return to her work without another word. Jackson appreciated that she wasn't chatty like some housekeepers he'd interviewed, but there was something about her extreme shyness that made him curious, or perhaps suspicious. He had learned that people who seemed too good to be true usually were. Maria had been working at the ranch for 3 weeks. In that time, Jackson had observed her carefully. She arrived exactly at 7 o'clock every morning, never a minute late. She worked steadily throughout the day, cleaning rooms, doing laundry, and preparing simple meals. She never complained, never asked for breaks, and often stayed past her scheduled time to finish tasks. The house had never been cleaner. She even did small things that weren't in her job description, like mending a torn curtain or organizing his cluttered office bookshelf. But Jackson couldn't shake his doubts. She seemed too perfect, too eager to please. He wondered what she was really after. Was she building trust so she could steal something valuable later? Was she reporting back to someone about his habits, his schedule, his security? He knew these thoughts made him sound paranoid, but his experiences had taught him that paranoia was sometimes just paying attention. One Thursday afternoon, Jackson made a decision. He would test Maria just like he'd tested others before her. He wanted to know who she really was when she thought no one was watching. He told himself it was necessary, that he had every right to protect his property and his interests. Deep down, perhaps he also wanted proof that his cynicism was justified, that trusting no one was the right way to live. Jackson's study was a comfortable room lined with books about ranching, business, and Montana history. A large wooden desk sat near the window, and across from it was a leather couch where he sometimes rested after long days outdoors. That afternoon, he deliberately left his wallet on the coffee table in front of the couch. He made sure several $100 bills were clearly visible, fanned out just enough to catch anyone's attention. It was bait, plain and simple. Then Jackson stretched out on the couch, positioning himself so he could see the coffee table through barely open eyes. He slowed his breathing, making it deep and even, like someone in genuine sleep. He let his body relax completely, though his mind remained alert. He even added a soft snore now and then for authenticity. To anyone entering the room, he would look like a rancher who had simply dozed off after a tiring morning. The minutes ticked by slowly. Jackson focused on keeping his breathing steady and his body still. He heard the old house settling, the wind brushing against the windows, cattle lowing in the distance. Then he heard soft footsteps approaching down the hallway. Maria was coming. The study door opened quietly. Through his barely open eyes, Jackson could see Maria enter carrying her bucket of cleaning supplies. She moved with her characteristic gentle efficiency, clearly trying not to disturb what she believed was her sleeping employer. He watched as she began dusting the bookshelves, her movements careful and respectful. She treated his books like they were precious, wiping each shelf thoroughly but not disturbing the arrangement. Jackson's muscles were tense beneath his relaxed appearance. His heart beat faster as Maria worked her way around the room, getting closer to the coffee table. This was the moment of truth. He had seen enough crime shows to know that good people could make bad choices when they thought no one would find out. The money sitting there represented what was probably more than Maria made in 2 months. Would she be able to resist? Maria reached the coffee table and stopped. Jackson could sense her stillness as she noticed the wallet and the money. He prepared himself for disappointment, for anger, for the confirmation that his distrust had been warranted all along. His eyes were ready to fly open, his voice ready to demand what she thought she was doing. But Maria didn't reach for the money. She stood there for a long moment looking at it, and then she simply stepped around the coffee table. She carefully cleaned the surface around the wallet, not touching it, not moving it even slightly. Jackson felt a small surprise, but he told himself the test wasn't over yet. Maybe she was being careful because she wasn't sure he was really asleep. Then Maria did something completely unexpected. She stopped cleaning and stood very still for a moment, as if gathering courage. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her own wallet. It was worn and thin, probably older than his leather boots. Jackson watched, confused now, as Maria opened her wallet and counted what little money she had inside. Her hands trembled slightly. Maria pulled out a $20 bill. Jackson could see from the way she handled it that this money meant something to her, that it wasn't spare change but something she needed. His confusion deepened. What was she doing? She placed the $20 bill carefully on the coffee table next to his wallet. Then she pulled out a small notepad and a pen from her apron. She bent over the coffee table and began to write, her hand moving slowly as she formed each letter with obvious effort. Jackson realized she was writing in English, a language that clearly didn't come easily to her. After several minutes, Maria tore the page from the notepad and placed it under the $20 bill so it wouldn't blow away. She stood back, looked at what she had done, and Jackson saw her wipe at her eyes quickly with the back of her hand. She was crying. Then she gathered her cleaning supplies and quietly left the room, closing the door softly behind her. Jackson lay frozen on the couch, his mind racing. What had just happened? This wasn't what he expected at all. The moment he was certain Maria was gone, he sat up quickly and reached for the note. His hands, usually so steady, shook slightly as he unfolded the small piece of paper. The handwriting was shaky and uncertain, with some letters formed incorrectly, but the message was clear enough. It read, "Mr. Montgomery, I break your mother picture frame yesterday. I am so sorry. This is all I have now. I will pay more each week. Please forgive me." Maria Jackson stared at the note, reading it again and again. Then he looked at the $20 bill lying on his coffee table. His throat felt tight. Jackson sat on the couch holding the note in his hands, reading Maria's words over and over. His chest felt heavy with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Shame, perhaps, or guilt. Maybe both. He had been testing her honesty while she had been carrying the weight of a mistake she had made, torturing herself over how to make it right. He stood up slowly and walked across the study to the stone fireplace that took up most of one wall. Above the mantel, he kept several framed photographs of his mother. She had passed away 5 years ago, and these pictures were among his most treasured possessions. His mother had been the one person in his life who had never betrayed him, never lied to him, never wanted anything from him except his happiness. Jackson examined each frame carefully. The first showed his mother on her wedding day, young and radiant. The second captured her laughing at a family barbecue. The third was his favorite, showing her standing proudly next to him the day he bought his first piece of land. He moved to the fourth frame. A picture of his mother holding a newborn calf, her face glowing with joy at the simple beauty of new life. There, in the corner of that frame, Jackson found what Maria had been talking about. A crack barely visible, running through the wooden corner of the frame. It was so small that he had to look closely to even see it. The crack didn't damage the photograph at all. The frame itself was nothing expensive, probably worth about $15 at most. He could replace it easily without even thinking about the cost. But to Maria, this small accident had been a disaster worth $20 she clearly could not afford to lose. Jackson picked up the frame and turned it over in his hands. He imagined Maria dusting this mantle, probably being extra careful because she knew these photos were important to him. Maybe she had bumped it accidentally, or perhaps it had simply slipped from her hands. He pictured her panic, her fear, her desperate worry about what her employer would say. Jackson set the frame down carefully and returned to the couch. He picked up the $20 bill and held it along with the note. Together, these two items told him more about Maria's character than any background check or reference letter ever could. She had integrity. Real integrity. The kind that meant doing the right thing even when it cost you dearly, even when no one was watching, even when you could easily get away with staying silent. He felt sick thinking about his wallet full of $100 bills that he had left out as bait. The money that would mean so little to him missing but would change Maria's entire month. And she hadn't taken a single dollar. She hadn't even touched it. Instead, she had offered her own money to pay for a tiny crack in a cheap frame. Jackson folded the note carefully and put it in his shirt pocket along with the $20 bill. He wouldn't give it back to her, not yet. He needed time to think about what to do, how to handle the situation he had created. Over the next several days, Jackson found himself watching Maria with completely different eyes. Before, he had been watching for signs of dishonesty, for evidence that would confirm his suspicions. Now he watched to understand who this quiet, shy woman really was. You noticed how she moved through the house with a gentleness that came from respect rather than fear. When she cleaned his desk, she never moved his papers around or looked through them. She simply dusted carefully and left everything exactly as she had found it. When she did his laundry, she mended small tears and loose buttons without being asked. The stitches were tiny and precise, the work of someone who took pride in doing things properly. Jackson began arriving back at the house at different times, curious about what Maria did when she thought she was alone. One afternoon, he came back early and heard her singing softly in Spanish as she cleaned the kitchen. Her voice was beautiful, carrying a melody that sounded both sad and hopeful at the same time. When she heard his boots on the porch, the singing stopped immediately, and by the time he entered, she was working in silence again, eyes down. Another day, he noticed fresh wildflowers in a small vase on the kitchen windowsill. They were simple flowers that grew wild on his property, purple and yellow blooms that most people ignored. But Maria had picked them and arranged them with care. The vase wasn't in a place where Jackson would normally notice it. It was just for her. A small bit of beauty she brought into her workday. He saw how she always made sure his coffee was fresh when he came in from the morning rounds with his ranch hands. She must have been watching for his return because the coffee was always hot, never sitting for too long. She prepared simple meals, but they were always nutritious and carefully made. She never wasted anything. Leftover vegetables went into soups. Stale bread became croutons. Nothing was thrown away if it could be used. Jackson also began noticing things about Maria herself that troubled him. Her clothes were worn thin, washed so many times that the colors had faded to pale versions of what they must have once been. She wore the same two outfits in rotation, and he realized these were probably the only work clothes she owned. Her shoes worried him most. The soles were worn down so much that they must have provided almost no cushioning. He had seen her wince slightly when she thought no one was looking, probably from foot pain after standing and walking all day on hard floors. She had lost weight too. Jackson was certain of it. Her face looked thinner than when she had first arrived 3 weeks ago. She never ate lunch, he realized. She would prepare food for him, but never for herself. When he asked her about it once, she had simply said she wasn't hungry, but he didn't believe her. One evening, Jackson was in the barn checking on a pregnant mare when he heard Maria's voice coming from outside. She was on her phone, speaking Spanish, in a voice tight with emotion. He didn't understand the language, but he understood tone. He had heard that tone before, from ranch hands worried about bills they couldn't pay, from neighbors facing foreclosure, from people trying to hold things together when everything was falling apart. Maria's voice carried the weight of someone carrying too much responsibility, someone stretched too thin, someone who didn't know how they would make it through another month. Jackson stood in the barn, hidden from view, listening to a conversation he couldn't translate but could feel in his bones. When Maria's voice finally cracked with what might have been tears, he had to grip the stall door to keep himself from walking out there. After the phone call ended, Jackson waited a few minutes before leaving the barn. He saw Maria standing near her old car, wiping her eyes and taking deep breaths, clearly trying to compose herself before going back inside. She didn't know he had heard anything. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked back into the house to finish her work as if nothing had happened. That night, Jackson couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about Maria's note, her $20, her worn shoes, her weight loss, her worried phone call. He thought about the test he had set up, about his wallet full of money that meant nothing to him but would mean everything to her. He thought about all the ways he had been watching her, suspecting her, doubting her. And he thought about what kind of person offers their last $20 to fix a $15 frame. What kind of person starves themselves to send money elsewhere? What kind of person sings while they work, brings beauty into empty spaces, and treats a stranger's possessions with more care than they treat their own needs? Jackson had spent 15 years building walls around himself, protecting his money and his property and his heart. He had convinced himself that everyone wanted something from him, that trust was for fools, that staying alone was staying safe. But Maria hadn't wanted anything from him. She had only wanted to do right by him, even when it cost her everything she had. He had tested her, and she had passed with flying colors. But in the process, she had tested him too, though she didn't know it. She had tested whether he was the kind of man who could recognize goodness when he saw it, whether he was the kind of man who would let his past pain blind him to present grace, whether he was brave enough to trust again. The $20 bill and the note remained in Jackson's shirt pocket. Every morning he transferred them to whatever shirt he was wearing that day. He carried them like a reminder, like a lesson he needed to keep learning. He still didn't know exactly what he was going to do, but he knew he couldn't stay silent much longer. The weight of his deception was growing heavier each day, and Maria's quiet suffering was becoming impossible to ignore. Something had to change. Jackson just needed to find the courage to make it happen. The days passed slowly for Jackson, each one adding more weight to the secret he carried in his pocket. Every morning when Maria arrived, he found himself wanting to say something, to confess what he had done, to give her back the $20 and tell her the frame didn't matter. But the words stuck in his throat. He had built his reputation on being tough, on being a man who didn't explain himself to anyone. Now he was discovering that pride could be a prison. Jackson started finding small ways to learn more about Maria without directly asking her questions. He spoke with Rosa, the woman who ran the cleaning agency in town. Rosa had known Maria since she first arrived in Montana 6 months ago. She's a good girl, that Maria, Rosa told him over coffee at the local diner. Came here from Guatemala with almost nothing. She's staying in a room above the laundromat, paying week by week. Works for me when I have jobs, and she cleans the church on weekends for a little extra money. She has family back in Guatemala? Jackson asked, trying to sound casual. Rosa nodded, her expression growing sad. Her mother and younger sister. The mother is sick, needs medicine that's expensive. Maria sends almost everything she makes back home to them. I tell her she needs to keep more for herself, but she won't listen. Says her family needs it more. Jackson felt his stomach twist. Rosa continued, not noticing his discomfort. She's trying to save enough to bring them here legally, you know, the proper way, with all the papers and everything. But it takes so much money, and the mother's medicine keeps eating up her savings. I don't know how she does it, honestly. I couldn't survive on what little she keeps for herself. After that conversation, Jackson couldn't stop thinking about Maria's life. While he worried about which truck to buy or whether to expand his herd, Maria was choosing between eating lunch and sending medicine to her sick mother. While he had a warm house with more rooms than he could use, she lived in a single room above a laundromat. While he had money sitting in the bank earning interest, she was working 7 days a week and still barely surviving. The contrast made him deeply uncomfortable, not because he felt guilty about having money. He had earned every dollar through hard work and smart decisions, but he felt ashamed of his suspicion, his test, his inability to recognize goodness when it had been standing right in front of him. Jackson began paying closer attention to the small details of Maria's day. He noticed that she always brought a refillable water bottle from home instead of using his glasses, probably trying not to create extra dishes to wash. He saw that she wore a thin jacket even on cold mornings because she likely didn't have a warmer coat. He observed how she moved a bit slower in the afternoons, probably from hunger and fatigue. One morning, Jackson deliberately left some fresh pastries on the kitchen counter with a note saying he had bought too many and they would go to waste if someone didn't eat them. He watched from his office window as Maria read the note, looked around to make sure he wasn't there, and finally allowed herself to eat one. The relief and pleasure on her face as she ate that simple pastry made Jackson's chest ache. He started doing this regularly, always with notes claiming he had leftovers or had accidentally bought too much. Maria always hesitated, always looked guilty about accepting, but eventually hunger won out. Jackson hated that she felt she needed permission to eat food that would otherwise be thrown away, but at least she was eating something. 2 weeks after the incident with the note and the money, Jackson made his decision. He couldn't carry this weight anymore. The guilt was eating at him, making him short-tempered with his ranch hands and restless at night. More than that, he realized he didn't want to be the kind of man who tested people's honesty through deception. His mother wouldn't have approved of what he had done, and that thought bothered him more than anything else. On a quiet Tuesday evening, after the ranch hands had gone home and the day's work was done, Jackson asked Maria to come sit in the living room. He had never asked her to sit down before. Their interactions had always been brief and formal, employer and employee, nothing more. The fear in Maria's eyes when he made the request nearly broke his heart. She immediately looked terrified, her hands twisting together nervously. She probably thought she was being fired. Jackson cursed himself for not thinking about how his request would sound to her. "Please, Maria," he said gently, trying to soften his usually gruff tone. "You're not in trouble. I just need to talk with you." Maria followed him to the living room, perching nervously on the edge of the sofa, like a bird ready to fly away at any moment. Jackson sat across from her in his usual chair. He pulled the note and the $20 bill from his pocket, items he had carried every day for 2 weeks. He saw Maria's eyes widen when she recognized them, saw the color drain from her face. "Mr. Montgomery, I am so sorry," she began immediately, words tumbling out in her accented English. "I know I should have told you right away about the frame. I was scared, and I know that is not excuse. I understand if you want me to leave." "Maria, stop," Jackson said, holding up his hand. "That's not why I asked you here. I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen." Maria fell silent, her eyes downcast, her whole body tense with anxiety. Jackson took a deep breath. This was harder than he had expected, and he had expected it to be difficult. "A few weeks ago, I did something I'm not proud of," he began. "I left my wallet on the coffee table in my study with money visible. Then I pretended to be asleep on the couch to see what you would do." Maria's eyes lifted to meet his, confusion replacing some of the fear. Jackson continued, forcing himself to be completely honest. "I've been betrayed by people I trusted before, employees who stole from me, partners who lied to me, people who pretended to care but only wanted my money. So I stopped trusting anyone. I decided to test you, to see if you were honest when you thought no one was watching." He saw understanding dawn in Maria's eyes, followed by hurt. That hurt expression cut deeper than Jackson had anticipated. He pressed on. "You didn't take anything. You didn't even touch my wallet. Instead, you left this." He held up the $20 and the note, trying to pay for a tiny accident that I hadn't even noticed. "A crack in a frame that's worth less than the money you tried to give me?" Tears began rolling down Maria's cheeks. Jackson felt his own throat grow tight. "Maria, you passed a test you should never have been given. I was wrong to doubt you. I was wrong to test you that way. You're the most honest person I've ever met, and I'm ashamed that I couldn't see that without playing games." Maria wiped at her tears with shaking hands. "I understand, Mr. Montgomery. You have right to protect yourself. Many people are not good. You need to be careful." Her understanding, her lack of anger, somehow made Jackson feel worse. She was defending his right to mistrust her, while tears ran down her face. "No," Jackson said firmly. "I don't have the right to treat people badly just because other people treated me badly. That's not how it works. That's not the kind of man I want to be." He stood up and walked over to where she sat, kneeling down so he could look at her at eye level. He gently pressed the $20 bill into her hand. "This is yours. I'm not taking it. And the frame doesn't matter, even if it did. Accidents happen. You don't owe me anything." Maria shook her head, trying to push the money back to him. "No, please. I break something of yours. I must pay." "Maria," Jackson said softly, "can I ask you something? Why do you work so hard? Why do you send almost all your money away?" Fresh tears spilled from Maria's eyes. For a moment, Jackson thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a quiet voice barely above a whisper, she began to speak. "My mother is sick. She has diabetes, and the medicine costs very much in Guatemala. My sister is only 16. She should be in school, but she has to work to help buy the medicine. I send money every week so they can pay for medicine and food. I am trying to save money to bring them here, where my mother can get better treatment, where my sister can go to school. But it takes so much money, and the medicine costs keep going up." She wiped her eyes again, embarrassed by her tears. "I have a good job here with you. I have room to sleep. I have enough. My family needs the money more than I do. When they are here, when my mother is well, then I can keep more money for myself. But not now. Not while they suffer." Jackson felt something crack open inside his chest, something that had been frozen for a very long time. Here was this young woman, barely making enough to survive, starving herself to send money to her family. She was living in a room above a laundromat, wearing shoes with holes in them, and she still found money to try to pay for a crack in a picture frame. "How much do you make?" Jackson asked, though he knew he paid her the standard rate for housekeeping. When Maria told him the amount, Jackson did quick math in his head. After she paid for her room, she was sending roughly 3/4 of her paycheck to Guatemala. She was living on what was left, which couldn't be more than a few $100s a month. No wonder she had lost weight. No wonder she looked so tired. A plan began forming in Jackson's mind. He stood up, his decision made. Maria looked up at Jackson with wide, uncertain eyes, clearly not understanding what he meant by things changing. She clutched the $20 bill he had given back to her hand still trembling slightly from the emotional conversation they had just shared. "What do you mean, Mr. Montgomery?" she asked quietly, fear creeping back into her voice. Despite his apology, she probably still worried that he was about to let her go. Jackson sat back down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He needed her to understand that he was serious about what he was going to say next. "First, your salary is tripled, starting immediately. You work harder than any employee I've ever had, and you deserve to be paid fairly." Maria's mouth fell open. "Mr. Montgomery, no, that is too much. I cannot accept." "You can, and you will," Jackson interrupted gently but firmly. "Maria, you're not just cleaning my house. You're taking care of it like it's your own. You mend things without being asked. You make improvements I don't even notice until they're done. You work longer hours than I pay you for. If anything, I've been underpaying you." Maria shook her head vigorously, tears threatening to spill again. "But I am just housekeeper. This is normal work." "There's nothing normal about the way you work," Jackson said. "And there's something else. I've a guest house on the property that's been sitting empty for 2 years. It has a bedroom, bathroom, small kitchen, everything you need. You can live there rent-free for as long as you work here." This time Maria did start crying again, covering her face with her hands. "I cannot. This is too much. I don't deserve." Jackson waited patiently while she cried, letting her process what he had offered. He understood her tears. When you had been struggling for so long, when you had been barely surviving day after day, kindness could feel overwhelming. He had learned that lesson from his own mother, who had worked 3 jobs to raise him after his father left. He remembered how she had cried when a neighbor brought them groceries during a particularly hard month. When Maria's tears finally slowed, Jackson continued. "There's one more thing. I want to know how much your mother's medicine costs each month, and I want the information about bringing your family here legally. I have a good lawyer who handles immigration cases. I'd like to hire him to help with your family's paperwork." Maria stood up abruptly, shaking her head. No, I cannot let you do this. This is too much. Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me." Jackson stood as well, looking at her seriously. "You're right, I don't know you very well yet, but I know enough. I know you're honest even when it costs you. I know you care about doing things right. I know you love your family enough to sacrifice everything for them. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." He paused, then added more softly, "And maybe I'm doing this because I need to remember that not everyone is out to take advantage of me. You reminded me that good people still exist in this world, Maria. You gave me something valuable, and I'd like to give you something valuable in return." Maria sank back onto the couch, overwhelmed. She looked at the $20 bill still in her hand, then up at Jackson. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll accept the help," Jackson replied. "Say you'll let me do this." After a long moment, Maria nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you, Mr. Montgomery. I will work very hard for you. I promise I will earn this." "You already have," Jackson said. Over the following weeks, Jackson watched as Maria's life slowly transformed. He had the guest house cleaned and furnished properly, making sure it had everything she would need. When Maria moved in, she walked through the small house with tears streaming down her face, touching the furniture like she couldn't believe it was real. She had her own space for the first time since coming to America, a real bed, a kitchen where she could cook her own meals, a bathroom she didn't have to share with strangers. With her tripled salary and no rent to pay, Maria was able to send even more money to Guatemala while also keeping enough to buy proper food for herself. Jackson noticed the change in her almost immediately. The tired lines around her eyes began to fade. Her face filled out as she finally ate regular meals. She bought new work clothes and shoes that actually fit properly and provided support, but the biggest change Jackson noticed was in her confidence. Maria still worked hard, but she no longer moved through the house like she was trying to disappear. She started speaking more, her English improving rapidly now that she felt comfortable practicing. She smiled more often. Sometimes Jackson would catch her humming while she worked, the same beautiful melodies he had heard that first time, but now she didn't stop when he entered the room. Jackson contacted his lawyer about Maria's family. The process would take time and money, but it was possible. The lawyer began working on the paperwork to bring Maria's mother and sister to the United States legally. Jackson also arranged to have money sent directly to a pharmacy in Guatemala each month to cover the mother's medicine costs. When Maria learned what he had done, she broke down crying in the kitchen, thanking him over and over until Jackson had to gently tell her that she had already thanked him enough. As the months passed, something unexpected began to happen. Jackson found himself looking forward to coming home in a way he never had before. The house that had felt empty and cold for years now felt warm and alive. Maria had brought life into it, not just through her cleaning and organizing, but through her presence. They began having coffee together in the mornings before Jackson headed out to work with the cattle. At first, these conversations were brief and awkward, but gradually they grew longer and more comfortable. Maria told him about growing up in Guatemala, about her family, about her dreams. She spoke about wanting to open her own business someday, maybe a small restaurant serving the food from her homeland. Her face would light up when she talked about her mother's recipes, about the flavors and traditions of Guatemala. Jackson found himself sharing things too, stories he hadn't told anyone in years. He talked about building the ranch from nothing, about his mother and how much he missed her, about the loneliness that success had brought him. Maria listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions, offering insights that surprised him with their wisdom. One evening, Maria cooked a traditional Guatemalan meal for Jackson. She had been nervous about offering, worried that he might not like the unfamiliar flavors, but Jackson insisted he wanted to try it. The meal was incredible, full of complex flavors he had never experienced before. As they sat together at the kitchen table, Maria told him about each dish, explaining the ingredients and the memories attached to each recipe. Jackson realized he couldn't remember the last time he had enjoyed a meal this much, not because of the food alone, but because of the company and the stories that came with it. The house began to change too. Maria asked permission to plant a small garden near the guest house. Jackson not only agreed, but helped her prepare the soil. Together they planted vegetables and flowers, working side by side on weekend afternoons. Maria taught him the names of plants in Spanish, and he taught her the names of different grasses and wildflowers that grew on the ranch. The garden became a project they shared, something they both looked forward to tending. Jackson's ranch hands noticed the change in their boss. He was less stern, more patient, quicker to smile. When they asked about it, Jackson just shrugged and said he was sleeping better. But the truth was more complicated than that. For the first time in 15 years, Jackson was allowing himself to trust someone, and even more surprising, he was allowing himself to care. 6 months after the incident with the note and the $20 bill, Maria's mother and sister arrived in Montana. Jackson drove Maria to the airport to pick them up, watching as she ran to embrace them with tears of joy. Her mother was thin and fragile but smiling. Her sister was shy but curious, taking in everything with wide eyes. Jackson had prepared a larger house on the property for them, one of the foreman's houses that had been vacant. He had furnished it completely, making sure it had everything a family would need. When Maria saw what he had done, she couldn't speak. She just hugged him tightly, and Jackson found himself hugging her back, realizing how much this moment meant to both of them. Maria's mother started receiving proper medical treatment. With good care and regular medicine, her health began to improve dramatically. Her sister enrolled in the local high school, nervous about learning in English, but determined to make the most of this opportunity. The family invited Jackson for dinner regularly, and he found himself becoming part of their circle, learning their traditions, celebrating their holidays, being welcomed into their lives with open arms. The ranch house was no longer quiet. There was laughter now, conversation, life. Maria and Jackson had developed a partnership that went beyond employer and employee. She had a sharp mind for business, and Jackson began asking her opinion on ranch decisions. She had an instinct for numbers and a way of seeing problems from different angles. He made her the ranch manager, overseeing not just the house but helping with inventories, supplies, and scheduling. People in town noticed the change. Jackson Montgomery, the man who had trusted no one for 15 years, was seen regularly with Maria and her family. He attended her sister's school events. He sat in church with them on Sundays, even though he hadn't been to church in years. The walls he had built so carefully were coming down, brick by brick. One spring evening, nearly 2 years after Maria had first arrived at the ranch, Jackson and Maria sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. They had been working on the ranch's quarterly budget together, but now they just sat in comfortable silence, drinking coffee and enjoying the peaceful evening. "I've been thinking," Jackson said finally. "This ranch has been my whole life for 15 years. I built it with my own hands, made every decision myself, trusted no one. I thought that was strength." Maria looked at him, waiting for him to continue. "But I was wrong," Jackson said. "Real strength isn't building walls to keep people out. Real strength is being brave enough to let people in, even when you've been hurt before. You taught me that, Maria." Maria smiled softly. "You gave me and my family a new life, Mr. Montgomery. You saved us." "Jackson," he corrected gently, as he had been doing for months now. "And you saved me too."
You just did it in a different way."
He reached into his pocket and pulled out something Maria hadn't seen in almost 2 years. The note she had written, and the $20 bill, now carefully preserved in a small frame. He had framed them together, the note and the money that had changed everything. "I'm going to hang this in my office," Jackson said, "as a reminder of the day a young woman with almost nothing taught a rich man what real wealth looks like. It's not about money in the bank or land you own. It's about integrity, honesty, and the courage to do what's right even when it costs you everything." Tears glistened in Maria's eyes. That money was supposed to fix a broken frame. Instead, it fixed something much more important. "What's that?" Jackson asked. "2 broken hearts," Maria said simply. "Mine, which was breaking from being alone so far from home. And yours, which was breaking from being alone even when you were home." Jackson reached over and took Maria's hand. Over the past months, their relationship had deepened into something neither of them had quite expected, but both had quietly hoped for. They hadn't rushed anything, letting trust and friendship slowly grow into something more. "You know what the funny thing is?" Jackson said. "I tested you to see if you were honest. But the real test was whether I could be honest with myself, whether I could admit I was wrong, whether I could be brave enough to apologize and change." Maria squeezed his hand. "And you passed that test." They sat together as the sun sank below the mountains, 2 people who had found in each other something they had both been missing. Jackson had his walls back down, Maria had her family safe and healthy, and together they had built something neither could have created alone, a home filled with trust, respect, and love. The $20 bill remained in its frame, hung in Jackson's office where he could see it every day. It reminded him of a test that backfired, teaching the tester far more than the tested. It reminded him that sometimes the poorest people are the richest in the things that truly matter. And it reminded him that second chances and new beginnings are possible, even for stubborn cowboys who thought they had learned all life's lessons the hard way. Maria's garden flourished. Her mother's health continued to improve, and her sister graduated high school with honors. The Montgomery Ranch prospered under the partnership of Jackson and Maria, who combined his experience with her fresh perspective to make the business stronger than ever. And on a warm summer day 2 years later, Jackson and Maria stood together under an arch decorated with wildflowers from the ranch, surrounded by family and friends, and promised to spend the rest of their lives as partners in every sense of the word. The ranch that had once been a fortress built on mistrust had become a home built on love, all because a shy maid chose honesty over opportunity, and a suspicious cowboy finally learned that the greatest test of character isn't how you treat people when you're watching them, but how you respond when they show you who they truly are.